On your computer, no application is more important or more frequently used than your browser. Yet, most people have no idea how it works. Of course, you don't need to know how it works to use it. As for me, I'm determined to understand the tools I rely on, so in this video, we will dive deep into understanding the browser. This is the main flow the browser has to go through when rendering a layout. First, it parses the HTML, then constructs the render tree, then goes through the rendering engine, and finally paints it to the screen. There are lots of different components in a browser, but here are the most important ones. UI includes all the elements you directly interact with, such as the address bar, home button, and settings. It is the visible layer of the browser. The browser engine acts as an orchestrator or bridge between the user interface, UI, and the rendering engine. It takes inputs from the UI, like a URL entered in the address bar, and relays commands to the rendering engine. The rendering engine is responsible for displaying the requested content. If the content is an HTML document, the rendering engine parses the HTML and CSS and displays the parsed content on the screen. To parse and execute JavaScript code, we have the JavaScript engine. It allows for dynamic content and interactive features on websites. The networking layer handles all network communications, such as HTTPS requests, to retrieve URLs and other web resources. It manages aspects like internet protocols, security, and data transfer. The UI backend is responsible for drawing the basic widgets that make up the browser's user interface, like combo boxes, windows, and buttons. It uses the operating system's user interface methods. For example, Skia is a 2D graphics library used by Chrome for this purpose. The data persistence layer allows the browser to store various kinds of data locally. This includes cookies, cache, local storage, and more. When you type a URL in your browser, like hungrimind.com, behind the scenes, your browser does not use the URL directly to retrieve the contents of the website. It can only do that using an IP address. You can think of URLs as usernames and IP addresses as phone numbers. To connect to any website, you need the phone number of that website. This is where DNS servers come in. They're like the phone books of the internet. You query the DNS server, asking for the IP that corresponds to hungrimind.com, and the DNS server replies with the IP. Now, your browser knows the IP address of the site, and it can connect to it and retrieve the HTML. After the browser receives the HTML, it needs to turn it into the page that you see. It does this by creating a DOM tree. DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it defines the logical structure of the web page. The DOM tree represents the HTML elements as a hierarchy of nodes. For every HTML element, there is a corresponding element node in the DOM tree. The root of the DOM tree is the document node followed by the HTML element. As the parser traverses the HTML string, it creates new DOM nodes from the HTML elements and appends them as children into the tree. For example, given this HTML, the DOM tree would look like this. There is no style sheet, scripts, or assets yet. Those come in later. Before the browser can render the web page, it needs to create a render tree. The render tree is what the browser uses when it paints the pixels on the screen. The render tree is a combination of the DOM and the CSS object model. For each node in the DOM, the browser checks if there is a CSS rule that applies to it. If a rule exists, it adds that to the render tree. If it doesn't exist, it adds the DOM node with the default style. And if the element has display none, it is omitted from the render tree entirely. Now, we have a tree with all the information needed for rendering. You start at the root of the tree and work your way down. The next step is to determine the layout and the size of each element. Now that the render tree has been constructed, the browser needs to create a layout. The purpose of the layout is to figure out the position of everything. Where is the header? Where is the footer? And how big should each element be? During this step, the browser calculates the coordinates for each element in this process. This process starts with the root block element, typically the HTML tag, and sets its position to top left, which is 0 in coordinates. Then it goes through one by one with each element in the render tree. The last part of the process is referred to as painting. Painting is where the browser goes through all of these layers and displays pixels for what each of them should look like. This is where the rendering engine and the operating system meet. The rendering engine sends instructions to the operating system to display pixels on the screen, and how this is done depends on the operating system. For Windows, it's done with DirectX. On a Mac, it would be done with Metal. The journey from a simple text input to a full-featured visual web page is quite the journey. You will probably find this next video just as interesting.